a lot of things cluster around that. And just to kind of put in perspective the situation that we had, I didn't pull together a lot of statistics or whatever, but a lot of you have probably heard, especially with the contraceptive mandate issue, a lot of you probably heard the statistic, 98% of Catholic women use birth control. Did any of you think that that can't possibly be right? Why can this not possibly be right?
There's no children.
There be no children.
How many are childbearing years?
Okay, good. I mean, could it possibly be right that 98% of Catholic women are even having sex? No? Right? So what this set looked at was more or less what the Planned Parenthood statistic that I had up a while ago looks at. Basically, women from roughly 15 to 44 who are sexually active. Meaning that if you're looking at women who are like obeying church teaching, they're not on the list. Nuns, they're not on the list. Right? So, like, it's not an accurate statistic anytime you hear that. So when you hear that stuff like that, I mean, yeah, you don't even have close to 100% of Catholic women in those ages having sex, so it's not even relevant. But nevertheless, so we don't really have very good numbers on the number of Catholics using birth control, but it is clearly quite high, and so I'll certainly grant you that the percentages of people using contraception are very high, and that's just that's the situation in which we live in. That more or less Catholics are doing what everybody else is doing when it comes to these kinds of issues, and so to our shame, right? But also to just be realistic about the mission field, that this is what we're dealing with. I talk a little bit in my book about contraception. I was a much later convert to church teaching on contraception than I was like with other issues. And I do think that contraception is the last thing that people come to. You'll find people on board on just about every other piece of church teaching except contraception. And I think there's a reason for that. And so in the book, I put it in the context of fear versus trust. I really think that the reason issues of fertility are so hard for people to let go of control over, is because that they're so intimately wrapped up with our future, especially for women, but for everybody. That we really think, what happens when I really turn my future over to God and am not in control of that? What if He asks me to have 12 children or whatever? Like we're just really, really afraid that something will be asked of us that we cannot handle. And it just brings up all of our fear and our need to control and our need to manage the situation. And it's very, very hard for us to trust God with this area. So I think that's very important to always remember, that when we're interacting, especially with the contraception issue, but with a lot of these sexual issues, that we're often dealing with, both in ourselves and with the people that we talk to, with a lot of fear. And so it's not just simply a matter, we don't want to just moralize at people. I mean, that's never useful evangelically anyway, but especially when it comes to these issues, that it's not just a matter of where they are in their head, what do they agree with or not agree with, or understand or not understand. It's also, what do they fear? What do they think is possible for them as a human being, And so it's really big stuff you're dealing with, and so you have to be sensitive to that, and that's why they respond a lot to personal example, because so much of what they're afraid of is that I can't do this. And if they see somebody else who can do it, and somebody else who seems human and not like, a plaster saint statue stuck off of the wall of the church or something, then it really helps them see the world differently. Like, oh, maybe I can do this. It's not just something for these exotic people. So just to kind of put that into perspective, I think is helpful. I think to really get at church teaching on matters pertaining to sexuality, you really have to get really basic and talk about sex in general. Like, just help people to understand, help us ourselves to understand, and then the people we talk to, what sex is all about. And the basic principle that I really encourage, that I emphasize in my book, and that I encourage people is, let's pay attention to the reality that's there. So much of our attempts in dealing with this issue, it has to do with, like, what do I want sex to be? What do I wish sex were? A lot of the culture is wrapped up in a fantasy world about sex, both very literally and kind of in a more metaphorical way, that we're not actually comfortable with the way sex really is. And so we keep trying to make it something else. And my basic argument is, even if that seems as though that would be much more convenient, you just don't win by fighting reality. That is not the recipe for a happy, flourishing human life, to fight reality all the time. And I think what we're doing with sexuality in our culture is constantly trying to fight reality. So what is this reality? So I think it's helpful to start with, really basically, let's talk about purposes, and let's talk about how pleasure fits into purposes. And I like to step back from sex and talk about something less emotional maybe, and talk about food, because it's actually very analogous. So you think about food, which we all just ate, you're probably feeling a little drowsy, full stomach. Why do we eat? What's food for? Okay, survival, it nourishes us, right? So food has the purpose of nourishing. Well, wait a minute, I thought we enjoyed eating. Do we enjoy eating? So isn't the purpose of food to enjoy it? What do you think? So, yes, both and? No? Okay. So what would happen if we treated food as though its purpose, its primary purpose, is enjoyment? What would that look like? It might look like our culture. Wait a minute. So somebody said, we would get fat, right? Would we probably be very well nourished in the food choices we made? No. What's the kind of thing that keeps us focused on making sure we eat the salad as well as the chips, so that kind of thing? It's because we know it's healthy, right? Because we know ultimately the purpose of food is to nourish us. So people like evolutionary biologists and people who think about this stuff, will tell us that there is a purpose, just speaking from the perspective of like biology and nature, there's a purpose to food, which is to nourish us, and the pleasure is there to serve the purpose, right? Because what happens if we didn't enjoy eating? What if like eating were like really, suppose like where all of our food was like astronaut food, it was all like freeze-dried and concentrated gel and everything. What might happen?
Eating would be like working out.
Eating would be like working out. Assuming you don't like working out, yeah.
You have to force yourself to do it.
You'd have to force yourself to do it. Would this further our health, or would this make our health more difficult to achieve? It'd make us less healthy, right, if food weren't pleasurable. So nature, or since we're Christians, we know actually God, the creator of nature, makes it pleasurable to eat, so that will do it, right? So yeah, so it all kind of fits together nicely. Now, if we confuse the pleasure as the main purpose, though, things don't work so well, right? Things get out of whack because the food serves a purpose and the pleasure's meant to serve the purpose and not the other way around, right? Well, this is, in fact, what sexuality is, and aren't those gorgeous children? They're mine. Number 1 and number 5. It's a great, you have to, I don't have any copyright issues when I use pictures of my own kids, so. Sex is very analogous to food, right? Sex has a purpose, and that purpose is what, biologically? What does it do? It makes new persons, right? New little babies. It's called a reproductive system for a reason, right? Sex's purpose is to reproduce. And so, again, you talk to evolutionary biologists, and they will say, you don't have actually, you don't have sexual reproduction universally throughout the living world, right? Some plants have asexual reproduction. I think some amoebas or I don't know. Anyway, it's God could have done things differently, in other words, right? This is possible. But we have sexual reproduction, and the biologists will say, well, sexual at the level of, sexual reproduction, all of this is to further this goal of creating new little members of the species, of whatever species we're talking about. So let's think about pleasure in relation to this purpose. I was in a class once at the seminary before I taught there when I was still a student, and there was so it was a bunch of seminarians and me and maybe a handful of other lay people, and it was a moral theology class. One of the seminarians raised his hand and said, if sex is, why did God make sex so pleasurable? Because, it causes so many problems. And the professor was like, what I deal with. And he said, if sex were like calculus, the race would have died out long ago. Right? Which is a perfectly good evolutionary biologist kind of answer, right? Sex has to be pleasurable because otherwise why would people do it? And if people aren't doing it, you don't have the race, reproducing. So again, you've got the pleasure, which is there to serve this ultimate purpose, which is that of reproduction. So in other words, reproduction is not this interesting add-on that's kind of optional, that may or may not be present anytime we're talking about sexual intercourse. Like, reproduction means that, as Jan Smith says, an act of sex has gone right. Sex is there from a biological perspective to lead to that new little person or that new little kitten or whatever. So it's not an add-on. It's essential to the thing. So for being attentive, we want to understand sex. We've got to be attentive to that reality, that reproduction is kind of essential to the thing. All right. So people then immediately say, well, what about infertility? If we're talking about human beings, and we're talking about marriage, and we're talking about, the fact that this is the kind of thing that's oriented towards reproduction. What happens if people can't have kids? What is that? This kind of throws a wrench into the whole works. And so what I like to do is give the analogy of cars. Now, I don't actually know anything about cars, so, but I know that they have complicated parts. And one of those parts is like a carburetor, right, which does something. And suppose, in your car, suppose your carburetor doesn't work, and hence I gather your car won't run. Okay, so that's your situation. So because your car won't run, let's first of all back up. What's the purpose of cars? Why do we have cars? To get us places. They get us from point A to point B. Now again, wait, don't we have cars because they're fun? Because they're pleasurable? Okay. Why are they fun to drive? To help us get from point A to point B, right? Again, the pleasure is, suppose cars didn't get us from point A to point B, would they even be fun to drive? They wouldn't even be cars, right? So the fact that this is their purpose is intrinsic to the thing, and then the fact that they're enjoyable serves the purpose. Okay, so suppose your carburetor's broken, your car's not running. Does this mean that car's purpose is no longer to get you from point A to point B? Isn't that no longer the purpose of cars at all? Well, no, right? Cars, if your car doesn't work, cars still have the overall purpose of getting us from point A to point B, right? It just means that your car needs to have things addressed. And of course, we have, as I'm not going to remember your last name, but as Angelo and Suzanne can tell you, the things like natural family planning that can be used to avoid pregnancy can also be used to help you achieve pregnancy. And so there's lots of ways to investigate how to fix one's reproductive system if it's not functioning the way it's supposed to. But just because some people's reproductive systems don't function doesn't mean that reproductive systems as a whole aren't oriented towards having kids, okay? It's hard for people to get this because we act all the time like things have purposes, but we don't think like they have purposes. Okay, so in fact, people really do believe that things have purposes because otherwise they wouldn't get in their car and turn the ignition key, right? They really do think their car's purpose is to get them here or get them to the store or whatever. But we hate to talk like that. For some reason, we have this bias against it. So it's really hard to get people to grasp that sex has a purpose, an overall big universal purpose, and that it's not pleasure, right? Because there's very few things in the world where their big overall purpose is simply pleasure. Mostly pleasure is a byproduct to get you to do the important things that matter. All right, so a little bit about sex. And you might be sitting there thinking, this is all kind of, you've mentioned evolutionary biologists at least 3 times, and, I haven't heard anything about the, good old-fashioned 3 hanky chick flick romantic love, where's the love in all of this discussion? Well, I like to start with the biology, with the purpose, because that, I think, is a little harder for us to get. And that's kind of the foundation. Because, if you think about it, human beings are not the only creatures in the world that have sex, right? We live in farm country, and people who live on farms tend to know this better than other people, but it's a universal thing that's bigger than us. But it is true that human beings aren't like farm animals, right? Our sexual relationships are different, but they're not completely different. And so as I talk about, what's particular to human relationships, I don't want us to ever forget that while we're rational animals, we are animals, right? We're also animals. We have bodies and we have reproductive systems. And when God elevates human sexuality to something more than, what you see out on your farm, it doesn't mean that he's making it completely different from what's going on in the animal world as well. And I think that, we need to really respect the fact that we're not angels. We do have bodies, and that's going to be part of our meaning of being human, not something we're supposed to suppress and get rid of and ignore. All right, so what about the love, though? So why is it that human beings, our experience of sexuality is so much deeper and more meaningful than what we see among farm animals? In order to get this, we've got to understand this word spiritual. Now, I teach this kind of thing a lot, and when people hear spiritual, they tend to think like incense and, the New Age bookstore, or whatever, crystals. None of that is what spiritual really means, okay? That's all very derivative. What spiritual means is that human beings, unlike every other creature except angels, human beings have spirit. And what spirit means is, again, not something kind of ghostly and, vaguely, body, what appears to you, in a horror movie or whatever. Spirit simply means two things. Spirit means that we have the power to know and we have the power to love. That's what it means to be spiritual. Spiritual beings know and they love. And so the classes of spiritual beings are precisely two. There's men and there's human beings, and there's angels. That's it. We're the ones who are capable of truly knowing and truly loving. And the reason these are called spiritual is because these are powers that transcend the material. They might use matter, right? We use our brains to think and all that. But has anybody ever taken a picture of a thought? You can take an MRI of your brain working, but can you take a picture of a thought? The thought is spiritual, right? It transcends matter, okay? So knowing and then loving, these are things that are above the material world. And that's what makes us such interesting creatures, because we are those animals that, have biological functions and purposes and all the rest. And yet we're also spiritual. And we are the only creatures who are this interesting nexus of spiritual and bodily. And that means that, unlike angels, we have sexual reproduction. We have reproductive systems, unlike angels. But unlike barn animals, we do it as spiritual creatures, as ones who know and ones who love. And that means that we can grasp meaning. Sexuality among the rest of the animal world is not meaningful the way it is for us. And so that means not only can we grasp meaning, we've got to grasp meaning. We are meant to understand things. And if we treat ourselves as less than that, we are very dissatisfied people. Because we're simply hardwired to want to know and to want to love. And we're always looking to do that. Okay? So for us, sex is something that has meaning. It doesn't only have a biological purpose. It does have that. But it's a biological purpose now that's suffused with meaning. Okay? And so if you read church documents, we've got Humani Vitae over there in the blue translation. What's it called again? It doesn't say Humani Vitae on it.
Challenge to Love.
Challenge to Love, thank you. It's a very good translation, wonderful introduction. I encourage people to grab one. In Humani Vitae, it talks about the two meanings of the sexual act. And those two meanings are what Janet Smith summarizes as babies and bonding, or in the church speak, procreation and unity. Okay? So for us, sex means the biological, but even that the fact that sex is oriented towards new life, that has meaning, right? It's not just, reproduction and, it's building a family, it's building a community of love, right? It's participating in the love of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit and communicating that to our children and all kinds of things that we don't simply see in the animal world. So that's this full, deep reality of sexuality has this foundation in the biological, but is so much more than just that. So when this gets lost, when the fact that sexuality is innately oriented toward reproduction, it's not an add-on, and the fact that sex has meaning to us because we're the kind of creatures that have to have meaning, when those things get lost, then all kinds of things follow, okay? And one of the immediate things that follows, and very directly connected, is a crisis of marriage. And I emphasize there natural marriage because I'm not even talking about sacramental marriage at this point. I'm just talking about people in or out of the church, Christians, Catholics, Protestants, Jews, whomever, atheists. The common understanding of marriage is just not there. That's what we see more and more, at least in the developed world, that people don't get what marriage is all about. And this really happened like the day before yesterday. We went through our millennia of human history, and even, decades after the sexual revolution, and people still had a common sense of what marriage was. And so it is a pretty overwhelming kind of thing to look at, but it's also helpful to realize, it's really recent, and, there was once upon a time where the majority of American culture was very strongly pro-abortion, and we're not there anymore. We're actually, people self-identify as pro-life, and even more are actually pro-life if you look at their actual views. So, I don't want you to feel as you hear this stuff that this is inevitable, because people are convinced by ideas as well as by examples, and so we can provide both compelling ideas and good examples, and hope that we can actually make an impact. So let's talk just a little bit about this. I want to give you a sense, first of all, of the stuff that's out there, and geez, you can just pick. It's like shooting fish in a barrel to pick quotes, talking about stuff like this. But here's one journalist. So marriage is more than anything else the expression of love. You're going to find this over and over and over again when you ask or look at what people say marriage is. They say it's an expression of love, it's a loving relationship, it's a commitment toward the future. These kinds of stuff get emphasized over and over again. And so this is the U.S. Supreme Court, and last year weighed in on this, Justice Kennedy. So he said, for same-sex couples who wish to be married, the state of New York acted to give their lawful conduct a lawful status. This status is a far-reaching legal acknowledgement of the intimate relationship between two people. Okay, so for Justice Kennedy, marriage is, legal state marriage is basically the state stamp of approval of an intimate relationship between two people. Okay, and that's that's just simply what's out there in the jurisprudence and everything else. So a relationship deemed by the state worthy in the community, equal with all other marriages. All right, so let's think about this. None of this is wrong, right? Marriage is an adult partnership. It is a friendship. It is an expression of love. It is a commitment. But is that adequate? Is it only these things? Is it adequate to say that marriage is an intimate relationship between two people? How many people here are married? Okay, how many of you would say you have an intimate relationship with somebody other than just your spouse? I don't mean sexually intimate. I mean, let me be clear. How many people would say you're intimate with your parents? You don't have to raise your hand, but just think about this. How many people would say you're intimate with your children? How many might say you're intimate with a business partner? Or, maybe not. But there are lots and lots of friendships and relationships that we have that fit what I call this cotton candy definition of marriage, which is a marriage as essentially a commitment of a loving relationship. I know that my commitment with my kids is a loving commitment that's never going to end. So how is it I'm not married to them? Right? But according to the state, according to these journalists, there's nothing to distinguish my loving commitments with other people from marriage. And so clearly there's something inadequate here. It's not that these are wrong. It's not that love isn't part of marriage, commitment isn't part of it. It's just they're too big. The categories are too big because you can lump a lot of people into them, possibly, depending on, the status of your other relationships and everything. People that you're not married to, and that you don't want to be married to, and that you would never be married to, like your kids, right? So we've got a problem here. This definition isn't working. So let's look at what the pastoral letter, the Catholic bishops, came out in 2009, Love and Life in the Divine Plan. So a couple of things that they're looking at. They have a whole first section is marriage as a natural reality, and that's all we're talking about right now. What is marriage as a natural reality? And then they go on and talk about it as a supernatural reality and put it in the perspective of God's divine plan. There's this reference, but there's also a lot of other resources. There's a really, I think I'll come to it. Actually, is it the next one? Okay, let me talk about the Code of Canon Law first, but I'll come to another resource. The Code of Canon Law gives us a wonderful, succinct definition that I encourage you to memorize and trot out every time somebody asks you. The matrimonial covenant by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole of life, and which is ordered by its nature to the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring. So what they just said is all marriage, not just sacramental marriage, has been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament between the baptized. Okay, so here we have, I'm sure I can, this has a pointer, but I can't find it. So here we have what it is and what it is for. Okay, so we've got the thing itself and then we've got its purpose. Okay, so what is marriage? It's a partnership of the whole of life. Okay, this means that marriage, by its very nature, is also a sexual partnership. Okay? And so it's really interesting to me that there's this curious kind of prudishness when you talk about marriage. You look at all those cotton candy definitions, they never mention sex. I mean, like these could be relationships you have with your children. They could be completely asexual relationships. One thing that's, if anything, is always assumed about a married couple is that, well, these people will be having sex with each other, right? Like that's just kind of part of the understanding of it. So it's a partnership of the whole of life, not just of emotional union or sharing a house together or whatever, but the whole of life, meaning also the physical or the sexual. Ordered for what? What's its purpose? Two purposes: the good of the spouses, and that includes their spiritual good, and the procreation and education of children. What we find, in fact, is that if you look at the history of marriage law, since, back in the ancient Near East when people were writing on clay tablets and stuff, states have cared about marriage because marriage is the relationship that ensures that kids are legitimate and are being raised by their biological parents. That's why the state cares about marriage. This idea that Justice Kennedy gives that somehow marriage is like the stamp of approval that states put on relationships that they like, that has never been true. And you don't want the state out there licensing your intimate relationships, trust me, right? I mean, I don't think anybody would say that friendship is bad for a civic society, right? Well, so do we therefore want friendship licenses? Right? Because these are intimate relationships and it's important to the state, and so you should, if you're going to have a friendship, you should have to go to your city hall and get a friendship license, right? Well, no, that's ridiculous, and you don't want the state license. The state actually cares not one little bit, objectively, if you look at it, about your intimate relationships. It's just not the government's business. Why does the government care about marriage? Because there are kids involved. That's always been why the government has cared about marriage. Because marriage is the place, that if you look at it, Solon the Great back in, the ancient Near East, he said, one of the things he said about his law is that I instituted marriage because it keeps the father in the household. So it was all, the government is there to make sure that kids, which are the future of the state, are being raised in an optimal environment as much as possible, to encourage that kind of thing, as opposed to, telling guys that once they impregnate the woman, they're free to go off and, never be seen again, which has rightly been understood as not being optimal for child rearing. Okay, so the fact that this is the kind of friendship that's oriented towards children makes it the kind of relationship that it is. It's not an add-on. It's intrinsic to the thing. Okay? And so once you understand that, then you can understand a whole bunch of things about, same-sex unions and why the church keeps saying these aren't marriages. Whatever you're going to call them, they're not marriages, because marriage isn't something that we tweak to fit the relationship we want. It's something that tweaks us, right, when we enter into it. So the fact that it is ordered to the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring is really key to helping people understand. But if you can see, with the contraceptive revolution, if people no longer think that sex has anything to do with procreation, it's going to be really hard for them to get how marriage should have everything to do with procreation. So this fundamental point, is marriage a reality that defines us? Or is it a reality that we define? Can we decide that marriage is going to be just a stamp of approval that we put on relationships we like, and therefore we're going to make the category bigger and bigger so we don't exclude people? Or is marriage its own reality that actually changes us, that we enter into, right? And so what we find is that if it's not a reality that changes us, society loses more and more and more of the benefits of marriage, because people don't want to, there's no point in getting married if it's not its own distinctive reality, right? If it's essentially just cohabiting or whatever, you're like, why get married? And so what we find is that people aren't getting married as much, both even at the civic level, but also, of course, at the sacramental level. So, putting this kind of all into perspective, I always emphasize to people that living the life that God wants us to live, which is called the moral life, is not a matter of lots of rules you have to follow, and here's the rules, the do's and the don'ts, and you have to follow them. Why? Because it's on the list, right? That's not a helpful way of thinking about the moral life. There are do's and don'ts, but the do's and don'ts are there for a much bigger purpose, which is not because I'm going to follow the list and check everything off the list. The do's or don'ts are there because they tell us, how can I live so that I can be really and truly happy? And it's often news to people to hear that God wants you to be happy, and that the moral life is actually an intrinsic part of that. The moral life is not the stuff that God throws at us because he's a killjoy and he's kind of testing us and he wants to have an arbitrary excuse to separate out the people he likes from the people he doesn't like or whatever. No, the moral life is there because God's giving us guidelines to be really happy. It's not, the easiest way to live necessarily, but it is actually in the long run the easiest way to live, because just when we're flourishing human beings living the moral life, everything goes better. Just is a better way to live. So, the fact that God wants our happiness. I call this, as a fundamental way of thinking, the way of gratitude, or the way of receptivity. So, we can either live the sexual ethical world constantly fighting reality, or we can live receptive to reality and grateful for it and say instead, how can I work with it? As opposed to always fighting against it. If you're always fighting against the fact that sex is procreative, it doesn't lead to a kind of graceful, receptive, grateful kind of space, which is a much better space to live in. And this leads to a little bit I just want to do a little bit on the theology of the body. This is going to be a very kind of cursory introduction, but in our world, instead of this way of gratitude, we have this way of fighting, this way of resistance. I don't want sex to be reproductive, therefore I'm going to fight that fact, instead of accepting it. What this has done is produced a whole culture of people at war with their bodies. And I contend that you really, really see this with women. If you ever go onto Amazon, just do a search for something like Diet Wars, and you'll be fascinated with all the books that will come up. So you see this in more than just sex, right? People have this antagonistic relationship with their bodies, and you really, women really internalize this, but I think you see it everywhere. We kind of view our bodies as something sort of outside of us somehow. It's what I call the undergraduate fallacy. I live in Boston where there's like approximately 20 million undergraduates, and they're riding the bus around me and stuff, and in coffee shops, and you hear these conversations, all kinds of interesting conversations. Up by Boston College, which is a Catholic school, I once heard two girls behind me. One of them said, "Yeah, I gave up sex for Lent." I was like, where do you start with that? Of course, it wasn't my conversation, so I didn't say anything, but I'm thinking, wow. On the one hand, you want to say good. On the other hand, you want to say, One of the many conversations that I've heard on the bus and stuff is along the lines of, oh, I got so drunk last night and I had sex with somebody, but that relationship doesn't mean anything, and the real me isn't like that. The real me has a girlfriend or whatever, the real me, so like there's what I do with my body, and then there's the real me that's somehow like inside it or outside it or next to it or something, right? It's this odd division, kind of mental separation between ourselves and our bodies. And there's lots of, reasons for this that go back, hundreds of years. But I think if you look for it, you'll see this everywhere, and you might, if you're honest, you can see it in yourself. I know that this was something that I've had to do a lot of self-searching about. How is it that we relate to the fact that we're embodied? And so is our body something that we kind of set outside ourselves that we tinker with a lot and fix to make just right? And often I think our reproductive capacities, our fertility, gets put in that category. There's me. And then there's this, intransigent, messy body of mine that's fertile all the time, and I've got to fix that because that fertility is a problem, and it's not okay. The problem with that attitude is, first of all, that you're fixing something that's healthy, right? Because a healthy body, a healthy female body, will get pregnant, right? It's only when there's problems with the body that it won't get pregnant, right? So you're trying to fix something that's already healthy. And it also puts you at war with yourself. And so when John Paul II comes up with the theology of the body, he really emphasizes over and over and over again that we are our bodies, that our bodies are an expression of ourselves, of our person. And what we do with our bodies speaks from our person. He calls this the language of the body, which is, related to but deeper than just body language. But the fact that if we're going to love, we have to do it as embodied people. We're not angels, right? So we express love with what we do with our bodies, with our smiles, with our conversations, as well as with our sexuality. So we can't just put our bodies at an arm's length from ourselves somehow and think that the solution is to kind of tinker and control them and fix them. And furthermore, that the body has a meaning. This is very countercultural. Because we think that bodies are meaningless and the only purpose to sex is pleasure. And you can't say that the body has a meaning until my mind, that's somehow set apart from my body, bestows a meaning on it. It'll have a meaning when I decide what the meaning is. And JP2 says, no, our bodies already have a meaning. And that meaning is that we are made for self-gift. He calls this the spousal meaning of the body. That we are made to give of ourselves. And if that's true, the way of gratitude says, I will never be happy unless I'm grateful for the fact that my body is made this way, it's made to have babies or to be fertile, and all of that is for the purpose of self-gift, as opposed to self-gratification. Right? If I fight against that reality, I will never be happy. And in fact, it's interesting that the kind of people who are able to string together lots and lots of pleasure, don't generally report being very happy. There's clearly a difference between pleasure and happiness. Happiness is a lot deeper than just lots of pleasure. And the reason is that we're made for a lot more than pleasure. There's nothing wrong with pleasure. Pleasure's great. Pleasure's fine. Pleasure incentivizes us to do good things, like eat, right? But if that becomes the purpose of our lives, everything's out of whack. And it's like a little lifeboat that you're loading all your household furniture onto. You know, it's not meant to support that kind of weight. You're meant to have your life be founded in something deeper, and that's self-gift. So this fundamental insight that the body reveals the person, and that body has a meaning. And when we live in accord with that, even though it's harder at kind of a superficial level, it's much more fulfilling, and thus ultimately much easier, much more happy-making than the other way to live. So that's a very brief overview of the theology of the body. And I'll go ahead and put in a plug now for the place where I work. I work at the Theological Institute for the New Evangelization, which is St. John's Seminary's outreach to lay people. And we have a Master of Arts in Ministry degree with Marika Gott. And then we also have a Master of Theological Studies for the New Evangelization, which I used to until about a month ago direct, and now I'm getting out of administration, which is good. But, the MTS has required a class on theology of the body, on new evangelization, because it's oriented towards forming people for evangelization, and we really feel like this is just key to reaching people where they are, because so much of our brokenness has to do with not understanding this kind of thing. So if you want to come spend a few years in Boston and earn a degree with us, we'd be happy to have you. All right, so we have some discussion questions. So how does a lack of trust manifest itself in our lives? This is something maybe you can just reflect on yourself, in the lives of those we serve. Why is it better to be receptive to the reality of sex rather than to construct it on our own? And how does our culture both idolize and demean the body? It's interesting because people think of our culture as very like body loving. It's not really, if you think about it. It's really kind of the opposite. So it kind of simultaneously raises the body above what it should be, it idolizes it, and then like demeans it at the same time. So, you know, how does that happen? But before we get to kind of more discussion stuff, I'd be happy to open it up for any questions. Or we can let you guys discuss and then come up with questions. That might be a good way of doing it. Hey, Suzanne.
I was just wondering if, given your experience, given your experience with integrating the theology of the body into the new evangelization, do you find that that's a concept that is met with excitement or met with resistance or a little both or somewhere in between?
On the integration part or the theology part?
Well, considering using theology of the body as a vehicle for evangelization, because generally I'm noticing there seems to be a fear of that term, theology of the body, and I'm not entirely sure where it originates, if it's the word body that's in it, or combining theology. At least it's not philosophy body. But anyhow, interestingly, a few weeks ago I was at the Theology of the Body Congress in Philadelphia, and they were using a terminology that I was fascinated by because it's reminiscent of days gone by, but it also includes the theology of the body. So beautifully, they kept talking about the Catholic sacramental worldview. And I'm not sure if that's a more accessible or permissible way to speak of these things, because obviously we are body persons, and we can't, if we ignore the realities of the body, we're not evangelizing the whole person. So if you could just speak to that, Mary. Thank you.
Thank you. I do notice so you tend to find people in kind of two camps. So you can find like theology of the body, you know, cheerleaders, you know, for whom like, you know, if it has theology of the body, if they're there, you know. Or you can find people who have like a total allergy. And in the church, we're talking, mind you. People outside the church have no idea what you're talking about. Like they're not even on the radar here. And I think the latter is sometimes due to a kind of not the over-enthusiasm of people in the former camp, but I think that sometimes the way theology of the body has been presented has been, this is John Paul II's sex ed course. And if you read the thing, you're kind of impressed with how little he talks about sex and how much he talks about the body. And so it's really much more than JP2's sex ed course. And now, where clearly it has, most of its implications, especially for our world, have to do with sexual ethics. And the whole reason he really wrote the thing was because he was intrigued by the resistance to Humanae Vitae and the church teaching on contraception. So that's very much a part of what he's trying to deal with. But it's a lot bigger and broader than just sexuality. And so I do think that that a too narrow focus on sexuality can really distort its meaning and raise hackles with people who just feel like, I don't know, it's like an underhanded way of moralizing. Or, sometimes things really do get sort of over-sexualized in the discussions of TOB, and I'm kind of have an allergy to that myself, because I do think the body's a lot more than sex, clearly. So I think that that's part of it. As far as integrating it with the new evangelization, I don't think our thought's gone very deep about the new evangelization, present company accepted. I do think that an awful lot of people who are tasked with thinking about evangelization at the diocesan level are very focused on programming and what program can I pick, and there's just not a very good sense of the stuff we talked about in the first talk, that, like what's the really deep issues here, and how do we address those at a deeper theological level, as opposed to, okay, if I implement this program, will mass attendance double within a year? It tends to be much more kind of numbers oriented. And so the fact that theology of the body has everything to do with evangelization, just the fact that sexual ethics has everything to do with social justice, like that kind of integration has not happened yet. So we'll keep working. Okay, well, we can go ahead and do discussion now, so you guys can talk about this or muse over these kinds of questions on your own, and then we'll come back in 15 minutes, something like that, and maybe further questions will bubble up. Okay.